All right. So the teaser today is we're going to get to the beast and the number 666. And we're going to find out. I should have said this on Sunday. We get more people to come.
I might have to listen to the recording.
Who is the beast of the 666? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You can't leave early. All right. So we're in chapter 12. We're on verse 6, 12:6. So at the beginning of 12, there's a new vision. So basically now in this part of Revelation, we have these we have this series of visions, and they keep switching. And they switch perspective too. They switch from heaven to earth. They switch in time. Some seem to be pointing to the future. Some seem to be pointing back. Now we've gone back in the beginning of 12 to the birth of the Christ, to the birth of Jesus. And so that's where we are right now. He has this vision of this woman who gives birth to the male child, who's clearly supposed to be Christ. And it says, and in these visions, like he'll introduce an idea and then he'll leave it and come back to it on the next cycle or the next vision, and he'll go deeper. So it's almost like you're in this spiral that's drilling deeper and deeper into these visions as we like zoom in and get more details of each of these visions. So, all right, so it says in 12:6, because and remember Genesis 3:15, when it said that the serpent, the woman would bruise her heel stomping on the serpent. So we have this imagery from Genesis 3:15 of this woman and the serpent or the dragon or Satan, they're all the same figure. They're all images of the same figure, is pursuing the woman. So verse 6, then the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days, which we said was what? 3.5 years. So half of 7. 7 is this number of fullness, almost like an infinite number. And so 3.5 can be taken as a finite number. So for a finite period of time, she will be in the wilderness or the desert. It's the same word in Greek. So here it may refer to the woman in the Orthodox view is clearly the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, but she also represents the church, right? Because she's the mother of the church. Saint Cyprian in 250 said, "He who has God as his father must have the Theotokos as his mother." So she's the mother of the church. We see her when we first enter into the church, welcoming us. So the woman, the Theotokos, also represents the church or Israel, and the church is the new, renewed Israel. So here it probably is referring, because we don't know of any time in particular when the woman had to flee into the wilderness or the desert, other than, when she had to flee to Egypt with the Christ child under Herod's persecution. But what we think here is that it represents the church, and particularly the church in Jerusalem, which had to flee into the desert after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So when the Romans came in, there was a revolt in the 60s, Bar Kokhba revolt, which this man Bar Kokhba was claiming to be the Messiah, and the traditional view of the Messiah as one who was going to be this earthly military leader, earthly king. He raised up this army of revolutionaries. They tried to attack Rome. Rome, of course, crushed them like an ant, and then in retribution came in and wiped out the whole city of Jerusalem. But what happened was a lot of people blamed the Christians for this disaster. Christians were kind of a easy scapegoat for the Romans and for the Jews both. So the church ends up fleeing out of Jerusalem and goes to Pella, which is outside of Jerusalem, and takes refuge there. So it could be referring to this idea that the church had to take refuge and hide outside of Jerusalem for a set amount of time. All right, now we're going to zoom in on what's going on in heaven and then what's happening on earth. So first heaven in 12:7, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, the serpent, Satan. And the dragon and his angels, the demons, fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So in other words, they're cast out. So Satan is cast out from heaven. So he was cast out back in Genesis, his first fall, but he retained the ability to accuse people before God, right? So, for example, Job, what happens in Job? Satan still has a place before God. In Job, he goes to God and says, "Let me tempt your servant," and then he accuses Job of all these things, and God allows him to do that. But what he's saying here is that, as it says in verse 9, as we continue, so the great dragon was cast out, the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So in other words, now he no longer is able to accuse. He's completely cast out of heaven. He has no place in heaven anymore. All right, 12:10. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, "Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ, Messiah, have come. For the accuser of our brethren, Satan, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down to earth." 11. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, martyria, martyrdom. And they did not love their lives to the death. So that's kind of an odd phrase, loving your life to the death. It actually comes from Judges 5:18, which was the language of courage in battle. So those warriors and judges who had great courage, it was said of them that they did not love their life to the death, meaning that they didn't prefer their life over a righteous death. Does that make sense? So he's applying this to the martyrs, to those who gave their testimony about Jesus Christ, that they did not love their lives to the death. Because remember, in this time period, John's writing in 96, we know from Irenaeus. St. Irenaeus is writing around 180, and his spiritual father was Polycarp, whose spiritual father was John. And he tells us that, and all the scholars agree that it was around 95 or 96 that this was written. So remember, in this time period, there were already, especially the Emperor Nero, for example, who died in 68 AD. He used to take Christians and burn them in his garden at night to light the paths of his garden at night. He did all sorts of things. I mean, he was the one responsible for the killing of Peter and Paul in 64 AD. He beheaded them in Rome. So already, even by 96 AD, there's a history of really violent martyrdom. And we know in the first 300 years of Christianity, I say this all the time, but it's important to remember, we had 11 million Christian martyrs in the first 300 years of Christianity. So a huge, especially considering the size of the ancient world, the whole Roman Empire had a population of 60 million at any given time. So you're talking about a huge number of Christians over 300 years were martyred, and including in the first century by the time John's writing. So that's who he's talking. He's talking about the martyrs who did not love their lives to the death. All right. And they did it, they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. So through Christ's redemptive work, that is what inspired them to not love their life unto the death. All right, verse 12. Therefore, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. All right, so in many Jews' minds at this time, they saw the end time, the last days, the end of time, as a time when Satan would be unleashed against God's people. So, for example, we see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they talk about at the end of time, Satan would be completely unleashed in one kind of final fury of rage, right? And his authority, Satan's authority, was always delegated by God, but permitted for only a particular finite length of time, to give him and his followers full opportunity to prove themselves wrong. So the devil here knows that his time is short before he's sent to the lake of fire in chapter 20. So he responds by becoming more destructive and more ferocious. All right, everyone following me so far? All right, so now we zoom in onto what's happening on earth in verse 13. Now, when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. So he's talking probably about, again, the church here, the brethren, the followers of Christ. He persecuted the church. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. All right, so time, times, and half a time is 1, 2, and a half, which equals 3.5. Again, so for this finite amount of time. The 2 wings, when God led his people forth from Egypt into the wilderness, it says in Exodus and Deuteronomy that he, quote, bore them on eagle's wings. And other Old Testament texts speak of God sheltering his people beneath his wings, mainly in the Psalms. So this idea of the wings is a reference to God protecting the church.
That it might... What happened to the apostles? Like when they were away from Jerusalem, when the faith focused died, and they all appeared there?
Yeah, according to tradition, yeah, they all came from, yes, they appeared on clouds, I think it says in the tradition, that they were transported miraculously, in other words, to Jerusalem to be with the Theotokos at her death, from where they were evangelizing to the ends of the earth.
That happened to Philip too, when he was on the road.
Oh yeah,
he was already
Acts 8, I think. Yeah. The Philip was taken, it says in Acts 8, and transported miraculously. All right, so, and then where it says that she was taken into the wilderness or desert, where she was nourished, that recalls what? When was it recalls Israel in the desert, coming out of Egypt in the wilderness for 40 years, nourished by manna from heaven, right? And also the prophet Elijah, when he was in hiding, God sent food with ravens to feed him. So there's this biblical imagery here of God taking care of the church, the Christians who are forced into hiding from the presence of the serpent. And he keeps using these terms, serpent, dragon, Satan, interchangeably. It's the same figure. 15. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. All right, so that's an unusual image. We're used to dragons breathing fire, but here he spews forth water. But we got to remember here that water in the ancient mind symbolizes chaos and disorder, right? So especially in Genesis 1, at the very beginning of Genesis, the earth was just full of this chaos of water, right? And then God the Holy Spirit hovers above the waters, and God starts to put order into the world. But the water was seen as chaos, primordial evil and chaos. 16. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. So in Jewish tradition, a lot of times we see, and Paul talks about this, I think in Romans 12, when he says that the earth groaned with man and waiting for our redemption. So there's this idea, especially in Orthodoxy, we talk about when man fell, all of creation fell with him, right? So when death entered into the world through sin, that death not only affected man, but it affected all living things. Before that, it's not clear that there was death of animals. So even the creation was affected by man's fall. And so there's this idea that man and the creation will side with righteous men, right? Creation will, their purposes are aligned in some ways. So we see in the Old Testament that the creation helped the righteous from their wicked human oppressors. For example, a tree hid Isaiah from his pursuers, and the earth swallowed and so hid the vessels of the temple in the Old Testament. So there are cases where the earth kind of acts and helps the righteous. So it looks like something like that is happening here with the earth, the creation helping the woman, the church, and opening up its mouth and swallowing up this flood that was trying to destroy the church. All right, 17. And again, so we shouldn't take this literally. That this is all kind of symbolic imagery. 17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring. So here is pretty clearly talking about the children of the church, the Christians. went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. All right, so yeah, whenever it says whenever it says of, that's basically the translators are punting on an issue. So in Greek, you know, the genitive, especially in ancient Greek, the genitive can of something can be translated a lot of different ways besides just of. But basically, when they have these strange of translations, it's because they can't decide what it means, so they just render it literally. But it doesn't help us. So what it means here is have the testimony of God, meaning the martyria, the testimony of Jesus Christ. So in other words, testifying about Jesus Christ. And this is a theme that John keeps talking about again and again, even in his gospel. He talks a lot about testifying for Jesus. It's almost like a courtroom image where the persecuted Christians are giving testimony under peril, under their peril, giving testimony, just like the blind man. Remember, he was brought to court. His parents were subpoenaed before the court of the Sanhedrin to give testimony about what happened, who this Jesus was, etc. So there's this recurring image in John of it being the job of Christians to testify about Jesus Christ.
Because that's how the church grows, by the testimony of the saints.
Yeah.
And the blood of the martyrs.
Amen. Yep.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I want to ask about the rock that St. Paul talks about that followed him in the desert.
Yeah.
And that was Jesus. Explain that to me. I'm teaching and I always say it, but I have questions in my mind.
I'm trying to remember now. I explained it when he refers to it in the Corinthian correspondence, and I explained it there. I'm trying to remember the details now, but basically, there was this idea in Jewish interpretation. It's not explicit in the Old Testament, but there was this idea that when Moses struck the rock with his staff and it gave forth water for the Israelites to drink and be saved because there was no water, that this rock, according to an interpretation, an old interpretation of the rabbis, that rock actually followed them in the desert and continued to provide water for the Israelites.
What I wondered about, because
So-
that's 40 years in the desert.
And so Paul says in the Corinthian correspondence, I can't remember if it's First or Second Corinthians, he says that Christ is the rock, was the rock. Christ was the one providing life for them in the desert. So that's what he was talking about. All right, so now that's the end of chapter 12. Any other questions about 12?
Is that where when Moses struck that rock, wasn't there something that God forbidden him to go into the promised land?
Yes,
Is that-
because of his anger and
Because-
striking the rock.
Instead
Yeah,
of speaking
That
to
was
it.
the one.
yeah. The way
He was said to speak to the rock.
yes, he was
And
told to
he-
speak to the rock
he
and he
cannot
struck.
strike.
Yeah. Which also you can see the imagery there of if Christ is the rock of him being struck.
Okay, oh, that makes a
Exactly,
lot of,
because he
that
was
makes
struck.
more sense.
Jesus
Yeah.
was that rock that was
Okay.
struck, the whole
Yeah.
theology
Yeah,
on
that
our
makes,
rock and
that makes sense.
Plus
Okay.
Moses, I think, there's a deeper, if I may, Moses could not cross them into the promised land. He was the law.
Right.
He represent, the law could not get you into the promised land. It
Yeah,
had to take Joshua, which means Jesus,
Jesus.
to take
yeah.
them across the Jordan, because Moses could not have crossed them because he represents the law.
So yeah, I don't know if you all know this, but Joshua in Greek, Joshua was translated as Jesus. So Jesus' name was really Joshua.
Yeah,
but-
Yeshua.
Yeah,
Yeah, means Yahweh. Yeshua, Shua, which means comes some save. Yahweh saves.
So that's- yeah, that's why in the Orthodoxy, we don't typically have the name Joshua, because it's really, in Greek, it's Jesus.
Huh.
All right.
Are you familiar with the name Josh personally?
Yeah, that's my legal name, actually,
Legal.
before I was ordained. When I was ordained Gregory. But yeah, because Joshua is not common in Greek Orthodoxy, it means Jesus. Although, you know, you see in Catholic tradition, like Latin America, a lot of people are named Jesus.
Jesus.
But in Orthodoxy, it's Russian, Greek, Serbian, it's just not done. All right, so chapter 13, verse 1. Then I stood on the sand of the sea. All right, so he's on earth. And I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. All right, so that's a very unusual image. So what's he referring to here? He's going back to Daniel's vision. Daniel has a vision of these beasts. In Daniel's vision, the leopard, the bear, and the lion are all separate and represent these empires, which we're going to talk about in a second. But in John's vision, they've all been smushed together into one creature. So in Daniel, they represented the empires that had oppressed Israel or Judah. So there were four: the Persians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and then the Romans were the latest. And these empires all worship their emperor as a god. And these emperors, these god figures, the emperors, had titles like Savior of the World, Manifestation of God on Earth, the Lord, Domitian, the Emperor Domitian in the 1st century, which would have been before John insisted on being called Lord and God. So it's interesting that when Thomas confesses Christ, and when he puts his hand on his son, my Lord and my God, Paul uses titles for Jesus all the time that are taken straight from the titles of Caesar, like Savior of the World, etc. And so that's part of the reason Paul was accused of treason, basically. And so that was really one of the main reasons he was executed, was for treason, because he was usurping the titles of Caesar and placing them on Christ. So emperors bore titles such as divine, God. We have coins from Asia that actually say God on them, along with the image of the emperor, or son of God, especially if the emperor was the son of the previous emperor who was a god. So these are, when it talks about having on his heads, these 7 heads, a blasphemous name, that's what it's talking about. These blasphemous names, calling the emperor God, was what was blasphemous. So this is there's going to be 2 beasts in this chapter. So this is the first beast, the beast rising up out of the sea. And I would say, and because its imagery is leopard, bear, and lion, corresponding to the empires, the Daniel, I would think we could see this beast of the sea. And remember, again, the sea is this primordial evil. So this beast rising up out of the sea, which in Jewish tradition was the idea was that this was Leviathan, right? It talks in the Psalms about Leviathan, the beast in the sea. So it's this kind of primordial evil figure. So this beast, Leviathan, that rises up out of the sea, represents empire. All right. So then it says, continuing in verse 2, the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So the dragon, who's the dragon? The serpent, Satan. So Satan gives the beast, the empire, Satan's power, Satan's throne, and great authority. And John says then in verse 3, and I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. All right, I'm gonna tease you on that one, because we're just gonna highlight that one, and we're gonna come back to it, I promise. But it's an interesting why he specifically mentions this. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So everyone went after the empire, right? What does it say in the Psalms? Put not your trust in princes and sons of men in whom there is no salvation, right? So John is critiquing here those throughout time. I mean, because like he names the succession of empires. There's still, all throughout history, there's always been an empire. Like you could say even now that the US is the current world empire. Before that, it was the British Empire, etc. There's always been an empire that promises great things to people. And I think what he's doing is making a critique of people who identify overly with the empire or with the world, and put their trust in the world.
Political power.
Political power, and opposing them to people who put their trust in Christ. All right. Verse 4. So they worship the dragon, Satan, who gave authority to the beast, the empire, And they worshiped the beast. They even worshiped the empire. Now, how do they worship the empire? Through the emperor. Remember, and so especially even actually the Persians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans all worshiped their emperor as a god. Especially in this time, in John's time, the Romans had a very developed imperial cult. So worshiping the genius of the emperor, the spirit of the emperor. So they worship the beast. They worship the emperor, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" So at this time, no one could imagine the idea of fighting the Roman Empire was a fool's errand. It was a suicide mission, right? So this is what they're saying: "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? He's so powerful and great. This Roman Empire." Which is what is attracting these worldly people, saying, look, we should identify with Rome and the Roman Empire. We should conform to their way of life. We should worship the emperor as they worship the emperor, because they're the ones that have power. And if we want to have access in this life to the good things, then we need to identify with Rome. So they worship the beast. 13:5. And he was given a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Again, 3.5 years. So this finite amount of time. He has time, but it's going to be limited. Then he opened his mouth, the empire. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. So here he's talking about the empire again, who persecutes the saints, the Christians, and overcomes them, kills them, produces the martyrs, like Peter and Paul. And authority was given him, the beast, the empire, over every tribe, tongue, and nation. The Roman Empire went forth and conquered all. It was a multicultural empire. So it went forth and captured all kinds of cultures and ethnicities, languages, and united them under this imperial worship. So they would allow them to have their local gods, all these different nations that had been conquered, but they all had to, what the important test was, the litmus test was, did they sacrifice incense to the emperor? That was always the litmus test. You can believe whatever else you want, but you have to worship the emperor above all else. That was the kind of umbrella that helped make you a Roman. So he makes war with the saints, he kills them, and authority was given to him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. And when it's talking about blasphemy against God, it's talking again about using these titles of Savior of the world, God, etc. All right, verse 8. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, the beast, the empire, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So all those, except those whose names are written in the book of life, in other words, the faithful Christians, everyone else will worship the empire, this beast. So the book of life comes to us from the Old Testament. I believe the first time it's mentioned is when Moses refers to it, when he says, God, at a certain point, God's had it with the Israelites. He can't take it anymore. And he says to Moses, I'm all right, I'm just going to wipe them out, and I'm going to start new with you and your seeds and your children, like I did with Abraham. And Moses intercedes with God and says, no, don't do that. He says, I would rather you blot out my name from the book of life rather than this book of life, meaning those who are your people, those who are alive in you. I'd rather you blot out my name from the book of life rather than these people that you've given me. So this is considered one of the great acts of true love, that Moses was willing to do this. And Paul talks about this. Paul says the same thing. He says, I would rather, how does he phrase it exactly?
To be cast out from the, for
Yeah.
the sake of my people.
For the sake of my people. He takes that same imagery that he would rather be accursed than his people be accursed, the Jewish people. All right. And then what's the idea behind the book of life as this? Again, remember, there were no books. Christians invent books around the year 300. So it's a scroll. But what's this idea of having the scroll of life? Well, or it could be a tablet. Sometimes they would have tablets, like the Ten Commandments are portrayed as 2 tablets. So the idea in general is that in the ancient world, it was very difficult to write something, very expensive. The literacy rate in the Roman Empire, even later than this, was maybe 3%. So you're talking a maximum 3% literacy rate at this time. And in the ancient world, early 1500 BC or something like that, you're talking even less. And it was very expensive. At this time in the first century, if you wanted to buy a copy of St. Paul's letter to the Romans, for example, just Romans, not the whole Bible, it would have been something like $5,000 for just a single like photocopy, so to speak, of Romans, $5,000. So it was very expensive to write things and very difficult to find people who could write them, difficult to find the material to write it on, and difficult for people to read it. So the idea that something was written in a book of life meant it stood as a monument, right? Like a literary monument that stood the test of time, that was fixed in history. If something was written, it was true, it was inviolable, it was eternal. So that's the imagery here. That's why also when we see Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, he's always quoting and saying it was written, it was written. Or Paul quotes the Old Testament, it was written. It was written means, hey, what I'm about to say is really important because this is something that was actually written down. It means this is something, a monument of history. So it's not like it's a complete opposite of today, really, where we have the internet, which basically most of the internet is completely worthless, right? Most of what's written on there is worthless. So we have this proliferation of words now. So it's really, now we have to sort and discern which words we're going to believe. But then it was completely different. All right. 9, verse 9. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. In other words, he's speaking in code, so to speak. So let the reader understand. Verse 10, he who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. All right, so the devil, via the beast, which is the empire, is enslaving people. The empire is also the one killing by the sword, and the saints are the martyrs. Verse 11, then I saw another beast, this is the second beast, coming out of the earth. So the first one was out of the sea, the second one is the earth, and it's actually called Behemoth, which sounds like what? Huh? Behemoth, behemoth, behemoth. A behemoth, that's where we get that word from. Behemoth is from this monster that comes up out of the earth. And he had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. All right, spoke like a dragon, in other words, spoke like the devil, like Satan. But he had 2 horns like a lamb. So here we have the second beast, which is coming up out of the earth, in other words, out of the underworld. After the first one came out of the sea, the behemoth looks like a lamb. In other words, he's presenting himself as the lamb, as the Messiah, as Jesus, as a kind of Jesus figure, as a messianic figure, a false religious figure who speaks like the dragon. In other words, the devil speaks through him. So here we're getting into this Antichrist kind of imagery. And then Enoch, and first Enoch, which is it's not a book of the Old Testament, but it was hugely important. All the biblical New Testament writers knew first Enoch. And there, the idea was that when the 2 beasts, Behemoth and Leviathan, when they meet, it means it's the end of the world. So here we have these 2 beasts meeting for the first time. All right, 12. And he exercises, the second beast, exercises all the authority of the first beast, the empire, in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Again, remember we highlighted this before, and I said I'll get back to it. Whose deadly wound was healed on one of its heads. So we're getting there. 13, he performs great signs, this false religious figure, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, All right, here the imagery is probably going back to Elijah's confrontation on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 19, I think. What happens? Elijah is challenging the false prophets of Baal that the wicked queen Jezebel was employing. She had like 150 false prophets under her that she paid for, that she supported. And Elijah challenges them to a duel, basically, to a prayer duel. And they go up on a mountain, Mount Carmel, and they construct 2 altars, and the prophets of Baal are not able to get God to send down fire to burn up the sacrifice that they left on the altar. Elijah prays and the fire comes down and not only burns up the sacrifice on the altar, but it burns up the stone altar itself. So this fire comes down. So this idea that you can cause fire to come down meant you were like Elijah, a great wonder worker, a great miracle worker. So that, in other words, this false Messiah will be able to perform amazing miracles, even like the prophets, which is how he gets everyone to worship the devil through him. All right, 14. And he deceives, this Antichrist figure, he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast. In other words, by the permission of the empire, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. Again, wounded by the sword and lived. An image of the beast. 15. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So what's the image of the beast? Beast is here the emperor, right? And the image of the beast is his idol that was set up in these imperial cults where people had to go offer sacrifice to the statue of the emperor. This was especially in the early centuries of Christianity, this was the main way that Christians had to prove that they weren't Christians. They had to prove that they were loyal to the empire by going before a judge or a governor or a mayor, some civil official, and offering sacrifice in prayer before the idol, before the statue of the emperor, right? To show that they were praying worshiping the emperor. And this is how many Christians got killed. And interestingly, in like the 3rd century, especially, there was this after John's time, but they had this thing called the libel list, which was a written document that the judge or governor would fill out saying, so-and-so came before me and offered incense to the emperor, to the statue of the emperor. And you would take that with you to show that you were not a Christian and that you were a good citizen and you couldn't be persecuted. You couldn't have your land just confiscated from you. If you didn't have that, you were subject to persecution and even being killed.
It seems like history is repeating itself with the 3 children of Babylon. In Babylon, the 3 children who were made to bow before the image of the king, and then they did refuse and was placed in the furnace fire.
Yeah.
It's like a repetition of the history, although that was way before, during the Persian Empire or Babylonian Empire.
History repeats itself.
Repeats itself again.
So each person took their own instance. It basically says it's division, it's not one authority like a priest or a head person.
I don't know. I mean, I think they had to go, so they would go before the judge and he would be sitting next to the statue of the emperor and they had to offer incense. So I don't know if they provided it for them or what exactly. So
You don't know if it's from common like you from the priest or a ruler or whatever you want to call it.
Who would offer the
Yeah.
incense? No, the person themselves would have to throw the incense into the fire.
Their own incense.
Into their own incense, yeah. Yeah, and which included priests, and there became a big controversy in the history of the church in the 3rd century because what happened was some Christians would forge libeluses, right? Or buy a forged libelus saying, so they didn't sacrifice the emperor, but they didn't want to die, so they bought a forged document that said that they had sacrificed to the emperor. And the church later said, after the persecutions ended, well, what do we do with these people? And then there were some Christians, of course, who went ahead and sacrificed and got a legitimate libelus. And the church said, after persecutions ended, well, what happens to these people? You know, at that time, the idea of confession was still kind of vague. And so this gave an impetus for the development of confession as we have it now, because there had to be some mechanism. There was basically apostasy.
Yeah.
Especially if they had actually sacrificed incense, they had basically apostatized from Christ, and now they needed to be reconciled to the church, and there's a big controversy in the church about it.
So they had to prove that they lied.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But there were some informers, right, that would go and tell the authorities that the Christians are not
yes,
sacrificing,
yes.
you know.
And yeah, I mean, always throughout history, you have that. And I'm sure that there were times too where people would falsely accuse, and that we actually see this in a letter from Pliny the Younger was governor, I think in Asia Minor, and he writes to Trajan the emperor, and he says, so he was the governor, so he was seeing all these Christians, all these accused Christians were coming before him. I think this is around the year 117 or something. And he writes to the emperor and says, what should I do? I've got all these people being accused of being Christians, but I can't tell whether some of them are being falsely accused, because we know that happens in history. It happened in, in my parish in Greece, I had a neighbor who lived through World War II, and she actually was telling me that they would falsely accuse people they had a beef with, right? So there was one case where her father, there was a dispute over the border of the land, and the neighbor actually went to the Germans and said that he was operating a wireless radio for the resistance, and he was killed, but he wasn't doing that. So, something like that was happening in at this time. And so Pliny the Younger writes to the emperor and says, well, what should I do? How do I determine whether these are real or not? And Trajan says, have them sacrifice incense. That was the test.
There is always a traitor.
Yeah.
I think even now in Gaza, for me, when I'm watching the news, how did they find where those 4 that were released of the captives or the hostages, unless some traitor told them where they are, of all that big land that's and the millions that are there?
Right.
There's no doubt there's always a traitor.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember my bishop in Greece one time during the economic crisis back 2008, 2009. He gave a very good homily one time, calling for the unity of the people around the church, saying that throughout history, if you look at Greek history, there's always been a traitor. What happened at Thermopylae? It was a traitor. What happened in Constantinople? It was a traitor who opened the gates. Yeah, exactly. It's always a traitor. So encouraging unity. Anyway, all right. Let's see, where were we? 15. Oh yeah. Will not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So those who would not offer incense to the idol, the statue of the emperor, were killed. 16. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. All right, we're getting close. All right. So the mark on, so where have we seen this idea of a mark on the forehead or the right hand? We saw it earlier in Revelation. Remember? 144,000. They received the mark. They received the seal of the mark of God through an angel. The 144,000 who represent the church militant, the church here on earth. So they were sealed with a mark by God, and conversely, kind of in parallel, you have those who are siding with the beast and with Satan, getting a mark on their right hand or forehand. So you have this correspondence between the good and the evil.
Does it not come from the Jewish tradition of putting the word, a lot of them, Orthodox Jews up till today, they put that word of God there and they bind themselves,
on the
their
hands,
arms. And I think that's that far back.
It could be, yeah. Yeah, we don't know what this mark is. Of course, today, you hear people speculating all the time, whether it's a microchip or a barcode or whatever. But I think it's interesting that John is setting up a correspondence here, so that whatever the one side has, the other side has to have something similar, right? So if the evil have a microchip in their hand, then then the Christians have to have something corresponding that marks them, sets them apart, right? If we're gonna follow this logic here, both sides being marked now. All right, so,
What is the number 666?
all right, we're getting there. All right. So, all right, here we go, 18, here it is. Here is wisdom. So just like we say in church, Sophia or Thea, wisdom, attend. Pay attention to what I'm about to say. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. So he's saying it's a man, a particular man, and the number is 666. Now here in 616. All right, it's later, and later to change to 666. I think of why this is the case. So to begin, you have this in Judaism before Christ. You had this idea of gematria. Gematria was a kind of symbolism with numbers, right? It was they would play with numbers, like we're always saying, 7 is a number of completeness, 40 is a number of completeness, 3.5 is for a finite amount of time. Numbers meant things, right? And additionally, we didn't yet have Arabic numerals like our numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 as we normally write them. Those didn't exist. So in ancient languages, they represented numbers with letters. So 1 was A. 2 was B, 3 was C, 4 was D, etc. So what does that mean? That means that if you added up the numbers of the letters in a name, for instance, you could add up all those numbers for all the letters in a certain person's name, and it would equal a sum total number, right? So it so happens that if you add up the following, you add up Caesar Nero, or Neron Caesar, it adds up in the Greek, transliterated back into Hebrew, which is how they use this numbering system. The number is 666. So Nero was, as I was mentioning earlier, one of the greatest, by John's time, was probably the greatest persecutor of Christians. Now he had died, it seems, in 68 AD, and John's writing in 96. But his myth lived on as this great persecutor of Christians. So he's saying that, and the interesting part is that so that's transliterated back from Greek into Hebrew. If you take his name in Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus and the disciples spoke, and you add up the numbers there, what number does it equal? 616. So what probably happened was, we think, is that Aramaic would have been the earliest, the earliest Christians would have been speaking Aramaic in the 1st century, 2nd century, John's time. So the original manuscript possibly was in Aramaic, or at least an early translation was in Aramaic, so that the number was 616. Over time, as the church grew and Aramaic faded away and Greek became the language, the number changes to 666, which is again the same name, but in a different language, calculated to numbers. Does that make sense?
What were the names that you said?
Caesar Nero, the Emperor Nero, Nero. So, all right, now I say it seems that he died in 68. Now, here's where things get interesting, and we finally go back to these repeated references to being mortally wounded and healed. So, although Nero died reportedly by suicide on June 9th, 68 AD, rumors circulated that he was still alive. So he's kind of like Elvis, right? There was a very popular myth that he was still alive, and in fact, we have it in writing, which, at this time, not everything's in writing, but we actually have in writing in 88 AD, so 8 years before John is writing, we have a poem by the Roman poet Dio Chrysostom, no relationship to John Chrysostom, the Roman poet Dio Chrysostom, that refers that there was a persistent belief already in his time, 20 years after Nero's death, that Nero was not really dead, that he survived, a mortal wound. He had a mortal wound that healed, and he was hiding in Asia Minor, Turkey today, and it was convalescing. But he was going to return and restore the glory of Rome. So this was actually so powerful in the Roman imagination that this myth is continued and known by Augustine in around the year 400. So already this myth lasts at least 400 years, and Augustine has to address it because remember, at Augustine's time in the 5th century, they're dealing with the collapse of Rome in 476, right? So the barbarians come and destroy Rome, take over Rome. The Western Empire falls, and Augustine is left to grapple with this idea: how can this have happened? How can this Christian empire be sacked by these barbarians who are not Christian? And he has to. And in 476, most of the empire is Christian, but you still have a significant pagan population. He has to address those pagans in his area or in the Western Empire who are still holding on to this belief that Nero is going to come back in 476 and restore the glory of Rome and defeat the barbarians, etc. So this is a very popular myth that lasted for several hundred years.
They blamed the Christians for the fall of Rome.
Yes, they
The
did.
gods, and that's why he wrote the City of God.
Yes.
In defense of it, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. So this myth, let's see, what else can I tell you about it? Yeah, so this myth, actually, there were cases in history where there were imposters, it seems, who claimed that they were Nero, who had come back. So during Domitian's reign, a Nero figure persuaded the Parthians, the Parthian Empire, to follow him to invade the Roman Empire, but Domitian defeated them and executed the impostor instead. So he did not manage to restore the glory of Rome. But anyway, it was clear that this was widely believed. We have Jewish kind of prophecies predicting the return of Nero. Many Christians feared the idea of the return of Nero because he was this big persecutor of the Christians. So it seems here that John is using this myth about the return of Nero, because that's why he keeps saying that that this beast who has the number, coincidentally it seems, of Nero, also was mortally wounded in one of his heads and yet healed, right? So the answer is, we think that the 666 is referring to the Emperor Nero, but it doesn't end there. We would say that Nero is just kind of a prototype, right? Nero is example A of the kind of person that is the beast of this Antichrist, because we have in First John, John says, "You have heard that Antichrist will come. I tell you that Antichrists are already in the world." Antichrist is plural. So you have this idea then that there's not just this one figure, but that there's this type of a figure that's going to recur throughout history, that's going to be this Antichrist kind of figure that's going to promise kind of almost religious-like promises. I mean, we could think in our own time think of Lenin and Stalin, for example, who promised this paradisical world of communism, right, where everyone was going to be happy and fulfilled and blah blah blah, and almost a religious-like promises, right? And Stalin then kills 50 million people or something like that. So you could say that Stalin is a modern example of this kind of Antichrist figure of the 666. So it's, in other words, an Antichrist means instead of Christ. So like we have antitheron in the church, it means instead of the gift. So technically, we take the antitheron and we don't take communion, right? So that was originally the purpose of antitheron. It was instead of the gift. So the Antichrist is instead of Christ. So it's something or someone that we worship above Christ, right? So when we put our faith and our trust in princes and sons of men, in whom there is no salvation, we've put something higher than Christ. This is the Antichrist.
Would Hitler have been an Antichrist?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
It could be money or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, here it's a man, but yeah, you could you can expand this to see a lot of antichrists that are always tempting us, even today, to worship it instead of Christ as the, and there's this idea too that like when he keeps talking about the martyrs, he's going to get to this later, I think, as well. We gotta wrap up. That there's this idea of what's your ultimate value? Like when Christ says, for example, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Doesn't mean necessarily that you can't love your father and mother, but you can't love anything more than Christ, right? So that when two things come in conflict, if, for example, somehow your love of father and mother comes into conflict with your love for Christ has to win. Right, that's John's gonna talk about that.
Putting God first.
Putting God first. All right, that's a good place to stop because we just finished 13. And then we're gonna start 14:1 next week.